Live.
Awesome. Looks like we're live tonight. We've got a few streams tonight. I'm excited. A lot to look forward to. We've got Brother Sal here, who's given us his time. He's always a blessing. We love to learn from him. So he's going to be doing a lecture on fitness, defining fitness, as well as Fisher's theorem. So we're really excited for that. I do want to do a couple of announcements. Sal tomorrow is going to be having his second debate with Dr. Dan. He's a professor of evolutionary biology. You can see the thumbnail there for the first one. That was a really good debate. Must watch. Please check it out. Guys, be there to support Brother Sal in the modern day debate audience. So we're really looking forward to that one. Sal did great on the first debate. So God bless you for that, Sal. We've also got tonight, after this lecture, Snake was right. He'll be coming on. Me and him will be having a discussion regarding ancestry. So that's exciting as well. And following that, we should be doing like an after show open discussion where there's going to be a few of us there as well. Debates in the future, we just confirmed for the most part. Kent Hovind and Ron Garrett will be going at it on evolution, hopefully in the next couple weeks. So that's really exciting. Looking forward to that one. As well as, well, a couple other ones we're close to confirming. I won't announce them until we do confirm them 100%. So a lot to look forward to. Enough for me, though. Let's hand it over to Brother Sal. Sal, thanks so much for giving us your time tonight.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for giving me a chance to share the things that are on my heart. The last 6 years, I've been in relative obscurity, just being a researcher and a reporter, and only a few people, like say 30 people on the planet, would read and hear what I had to say. And so the Standing for Truth channel has given me an opportunity to meet larger audiences. And this is especially important now that Dr. Sanford and I are hoping to publish a booklet series. And he emailed me yesterday and said, hey, let's even do some videos together. So I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful for all the people that came out and showed their support at my first debate last week on Modern Day Debate. We have already almost 5,000 views, 5,000 views. And just to give you an idea how much that means to me, this past November at my church of 13,000 members, only 4 people showed up to hear me speak. So what you guys have done has been a real encouragement, because that can be really discouraging when I want to talk about creation in a Christian church and only 4 people show up. It's really sometimes heartbreaking. But I just said, well, Lord, maybe you just want me somewhere else. So it looks like the internet is where it's going to be at. And I'm extremely grateful to the Standing for Truth team, John Maddox and Raw Matt and Praise and all the others. Jason, and I know I'm going to forget some names. I'm really sorry if I forgot your name.
Don't even worry.
I do that, guys. Well, let me tell you, I'm just not really good with names. That's just me. It's really bad when you're out on a date and you say goodnight and you use the wrong girl's name. That's just really bad. I got punched for that. So don't take it personal if I don't get your name straight. So that said, I'm really excited about tomorrow. It's a real privilege to actually debate a professor of evolutionary biology. He's been following my writings on the internet very studiously over the last 3 years. So it's really great to finally encounter him on the live debate stage. So I know that what I've said has definitely caught his attention, and he feels he needs to say something. So I just want to shout out to all my fans out there. So that said, let me talk about Fisher's theorem. I'm going to mention it in passing tomorrow. So just a little bit of things about Fisher's theorem. This is really cool. There's this journal of mathematical biology, And in 2017, Bill Basner, who's an emeritus professor of mathematics, and John Sanford published an article in that journal that was critical of evolutionary biology. And praise God, that article got more downloads, since it's open access, got more downloads and more views than any article in the journal's history by far. And in way back in even last year they had 7,000 downloads. They broke the record already. They set the record, and editors were contacting them and saying, "Hey, can you come out and do a new paper?" And they were getting invitations, and then now they're up to 16,000 downloads. So not only did they break the record, they keep breaking the record. And so this is really cool because the creationists were able to do what the evolutionary biologists couldn't do in this journal. So praise God for that. It got people's attention. So this is the theorem. And we won't go through the heavy math. We're going to go through some of the more, what I think, foundational issues. But if you wanted to know what Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection is, after it got corrected by Bill Basner and John Sanford, this is what it looks like. So they're saying dm dt, dm with the little mean sign there, dt is equal to this. And that's just kind of a monstrosity. But that really impressed a lot of people. And that was years of hard work to come up with this proof. And it was devastating for Darwinian evolution. But there's some backstories to that. I'm going to cover what happened was because editors were approaching Bill Basner and John Sanford for follow-on work, I got recruited to be doing some of the follow-on work because I do have a mathematical background. I'm really not a biologist by training. I'm only a recent biologist, quote unquote. That's the theorem right there. I'm going to cover the simplified version, but please don't run away because the fun stuff is not going to be in the math. Now, I want you to see this. This is a very interesting book. It's called Survival of the Sickest. Survival of the Sickest. Does that sound familiar? Like Survival of the Fittest? Well, this so-called medical maverick, Dr. Sharon Molem, he said, the subtitle's not, here it is. A medical maverick discovers why we need disease. Why we need disease. Now, the reason that's, if that sounds kind of bizarre, it is because it is bizarre. There's a problem with Darwinian evolution in that maybe 90% of the mutations that they think are beneficial, that they classify as beneficial, as good in their world, are actually function loss of function. So their theory is so bad that they have to grasp for straws. They can't actually find, they have only very few examples of any sort of real improvement. So they have to kind of inflate their books because the accounting looks really bad. This is just it's just a bad theory. And the way that they inflate it is say, look at all these beneficial mutations, but then when you look at and you scrutinize and you do an audit, most of them are bad. And so this is one example of it. So what's really funny about this book is the guy was dead serious. He was saying, this is in the pages, he was saying, this is an example of why Darwin was such a genius. You know, he saw we could take his theory and it explains why we're all so sick. So let me see. I'm gonna unshare my screen, and maybe if you have any comments about that while I get my other screen up in the meantime.
Well, for me, it seems that if you're completely sold on a theory as being the foundation for your very existence, then obviously if your theory is only showing evidence of negative versus positive, or almost entirely negative, maybe kind of sort of a little bit of positive, then a rational person is going to have to come up with some kind of alternative solution. Otherwise, the negative is always going to outweigh the positive, right? And I think that's something you're going to kind of show here from a mathematical perspective, right?
Right. And really, I'm going to try to show it more from just because in this short time, we won't really have an opportunity to go through all the math, and I don't want to bore the readers. Just for those who are real nerds and want to be in nerd heaven, I'm going to be posting my papers, the derivation of the simple version of Fisher's theorem, and you can actually see the proofs and all that. And then some of the numerical simulations for those that really want to get down into the weeds. But the reason I felt it on my heart to talk about this aspect of it is when creationists use the word fitness, remember that it may not mean to an evolutionary biologist what you think. Because if 90% of the beneficial mutations, that figure came from Michael Behe's peer-reviewed paper in the Biology Quarterly Review, so that's a peer-reviewed scientific journal. That figure of about 90% comes from his work. It may not specifically be in that paper, but that is the figure he informally derived from his own having written that article. That if 90% are bad, so when a Darwinist says, these are beneficial mutations, just step back a little bit and say, how credible is that? Because if these beneficial mutations end up being permanent part of the population, that's genetic deterioration. That's bad. So they're doing what is known as equivocating, where they say one word and it means one thing to them, and then it means something different to another. Or maybe they know in the same sentence that they're using two different meanings of the same word. They're using two different meanings of the same word, but it ends up being very misleading what is being actually argued. So when they may say, oh, fitness is increasing, it could well mean, and I'll give some examples of that the organism is losing body parts and losing organs and losing function. And let's say, well, we have all this proof that fitness is increasing. I don't know where genetic entropy comes in. And so this past January, after being recruited to work on this, the follow-on to Fisher, to John and Bill Basner's work on the Fisher's fundamental theorem, I said, hey guys, I've been looking through the literature. We got to be careful about, our language here when we say beneficial or deleterious or neutral, because all of them could be bad. I mean, it's pretty bad when a deleterious mutation's bad, a neutral mutation's bad, and then a beneficial mutation's bad. So we don't need to cut them any more slack and let them get away with the obfuscation. So that's why I'm really pointing it out. So that's why when you hear me talk about genetic entropy, you won't see the language that was in John Sanford's 2005 book, where he talks about deleterious, neutral, and beneficial, because all three could be function compromising. They could all be loss of function. All three. So it's like, let's not give them any quarter here for their equivocations and obfuscations. We're going to call it out. We're going to call a spade a spade. And when I showed John Sanford that book, I said, hey, did you hear that book? Did you hear about that book, Survival of the Sickest? And he said, no. I said, hey, this is how they solved genetic entropy. They solved it by saying sickness is a beneficial mutation. Problem solved. And he just started laughing. So I said, there's an old saying in the software world. It's not a bug, it's a feature. So basically, the evolutionary community has succeeded in selling the idea that their theory is so good by selling the idea that bugs in their theory are actually features and they're evidence of genius. So that's what I wanted to point out. So I'm going to share my screen a little bit, and feel free to interrupt me this time if you all have any questions. So I just wanted to say that's why I'm trying to avoid, there's a lot of discussion about beneficial, near neutral, and neutral and deleterious. What I did in my first debate, where I used Mueller's limit and the math surrounding that, you could use that math and you don't have to worry about beneficial, neutral, or deleterious. That math covers any definition of fitness, any definition, whether it's the evolutionary biology definition or the more correct one that's in line with common sense, medical sense and engineering sense. So I'm just going to give a little bit. This is an article I wrote for Creation Evolution Headlines. If you're not familiar with this, website, You may want to visit it. It is a little bit humorous. I write a very small fraction of the articles there. Most of them are written by the owner, David Coppage, and he has a great sense of humor. So I wrote this, and he edited it. He edited the article, and he made it even more entertaining. So this is what's happened. The reason I highlight this, I want you to see how mythology plays out in evolutionary biology. Not just the myth of evolution, but even among the way that they talk about their achievements. It's really kind of funny. So the title of the article I wrote, and I'm sorry to read this, but I enjoy, it's easier sometimes for me not to ad lib, but just to read what I've written, because I'm not a very good extemporaneous speaker. But anyway, the father of neo-Darwinism condemned with faint praise. National NAS member, that's National Academy of Science members' comedic eulogy of Fisher's theorem of natural selection. The father of neo-Darwinism, R.A. Fisher, put forward what he called the fundamental theorem of natural selection, FTNS, in 1930. This mathematically impressive theorem, of which Fisher was very proud, was long considered to be one of the main pillars of neo-Darwinian theory. Almost comically, it is now referred to in some evolutionary circles as Fisher's not so fundamental theorem of natural selection. We might give it a corrected abbreviation, SFFTNS. Bill Baster and John Sanford recently provided a correction to Fisher's equations in the FTNS that demonstrated real evolution proceeds toward destruction rather than construction of biological function. It basically flips Fisher's theorem upside down. Concurrently, and equally comedic, something odd happened at the 37th Memorial Lecture on January 4th, 2018, meant to honor the memory of the late R.A. Fisher. Joe Felsenstein, a National Academy of Science member, condemned Fisher's work with faint praise. I think that's kind of a English way of saying, if you can kind of criticize someone by, giving it kind of, superficial praise, but it's really kind of an insult. So basically, he criticized Fisher's famous theorem, but tried to do it in a nice way. After all, this was a memorial lecture intended to honor Fisher's accomplishments. As with many eulogies, Felsenstein tried to put as much whitewash on the failures of the deceased as the individual possible. He said, in spite of Fisher's assertion that the theorem holds the supreme position among the biological sciences, the fundamental theorem is, alas, not so fundamental, end quote. So this is after decades, people sort of knew that Fisher's theorem really wasn't fundamental. But finally, after all the years after Fisher's death, they're finally kind of admitting it. But it's just really kind of funny to have that said at kind of a memorial lecture for the poor guy. So there was the criticism, now the whitewash. How would Felsenstein manage to elevate Fisher's work and make it look like a stellar accomplishment, given that he's on the spot to eulogize the deceased father of neo-Darwinian theory? Well, Felsenstein may not have intended to do so, but he made Fisher's work look better than his own by comparison. He did this by pointing out how much more widely cited Fisher's work has been than one of his own absurd models, which in turn he claimed is better than all the other absurd models out there. So watch this. This is what Felsenstein said. He said, I will not attempt to revive the FTNS, Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection, which turned out to not be so fundamental after all. But instead, I am trying to extend a 1978 model of mine, put forth in what may be my least cited paper. This attempts to make a toy model of an evolving population. I'm not going to read the whole article since we're short for time, but what Felsenstein is doing here, it reminds me of this joke. And I'll read the joke. In a small town, there were two brothers who, over the course of many years, cheated, swindled, robbed, and generally stole from everyone that they ever did business with. The entire town and surrounding community reviled and despised these two brothers, as everyone was aware of just how disreputable and dishonest they were. One day, one of the brothers mysteriously died. Although they had never attended church, the one remaining brother went to the local pastor and offered vast sums of money if he would come to the funeral and say the appropriate words and a large bonus, but only if he would, during the course of the eulogy, refer to his brother as a quote unquote saint. The pastor was troubled by the request. However, it was a very poor church, and the church desperately needed repairs. The parishioners had heard about the pastor's dilemma and were curious as to what he would do. The funeral began. The church was packed, and the pastor started with the usual prayers and followed the rites and traditions as required by the church teachings. In closing, after referring to the man in the box, he paused and turned to the face of the remaining brother. He began, as you all know, the departed was an awful individual who robbed, cheated, swindled, and stole from everyone he ever did business with. However, compared to his brother, he was a saint. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just take a pause while I get my next screen up. So that was really kind of funny at the memorial lecture, the way he was able to try to build up, he would say Fisher's theorem is wrong. So it's not just John Sanford and Bill Basner. It's the top evolutionary biologists are now admitting that it's wrong. And what's really bad is this theorem has been advertised as biology's central theorem, that all of biology hangs on this. And yet the funny thing is, most biology students I know, even biology professors, don't know what Fisher's theorem is. So that tells me this whole thing is mostly a myth, that it's biology's central theorem. But because it was used as a myth to promote evolutionary theory, they let the myth keep getting perpetuated. See what I'm trying to say is there are myths even in the present day of evolutionary biology. They'll claim that they've proven something and it's not been proven. And there are plenty of people in the know that know that it has not been proven. And they just let the myth keep persisting. And Fisher's fundamental theorem is one of those. So I'm just going to share my screen, and I'm going to read from a little bit of the abstract. And maybe in 20 minutes, we'll just wrap up. Since I know there's a debate coming, maybe I'll take some questions from the audience. But let me just read the abstract so you can get a summary, and then I'll cover some of the main points. I'm not going to go deep in. I'm not going to go into the math at all. I will try to post this on my website. Actually, let me type this in the private chat. I don't know how to put it in the live. Oh, I think I could put it in the live chat. Can I put website names on the live chat? Let me try. I'm going to just try to type it in. Hang on. www.evidenceandreasons.org. Hey, let me type it in. You just can't hyperlink to it. That's my website. I'm still under construction. I will refer to it in my debate, and hopefully I'm going to post this paper there so you can see it. So the abstract is: Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection, FTNS, was called biology's central theorem, but ironically, such accolades are by and large a myth. Joseph Felsenstein, when delivering the Fisher Memorial Lecture, with regret declared FTNS was not so fundamental. Not only does FTNS do little to nothing to explain biological evolution, but like most population genetic and evolutionary literature, FTNS relies on a definition of fitness in terms of population growth rates rather than the biophysical notions of fitness, which are more in line with the common sense intuitions of the medical and engineering community. From the perspective of the mechanical rather than the population growth notions of fitness, natural selection might be more accurately described as an agent against the increase of complexity, but rather a facilitator for the destruction of complexity. Thus, some sort of anti-weasel model of natural selection might be a better model of how selection actually works in nature rather than Dawkins' weasel or other man-made genetic algorithms. However, the main focus of this communication will provide some pedagogical insight through some simple numerical illustrations of Fisher's theorem. The hope is that this will show the general irrelevance of FTNS to the question of evolution of complexity by means of natural selection, and thus demonstrate in broad terms Felsenstein's regret that Fisher's theorem is not so fundamental after all. So again, for those of you that are, especially in debate, when you argue about fitness, just be very, maybe the takeaway from all this is they're not playing from the same definitions, and they're that you and I might be, or the public at large, or common sense. They're not playing from the same definitions, and that can be very misleading, and it's often used to their advantage because they'll be citing all these proofs of fitness increase, and upon further scrutiny, they're actually proof of genetic deterioration. So once you start using words like deleterious, neutral, and beneficial, you're letting them define the terms. And God bless Dr. Sanford. He advised me. He said, Salvador, whenever you let the party that defines the terms of the debate wins the debate. You can't let them define the terms for you. So when they call out beneficial, we need to call them out on it and say that's not really beneficial. It's not necessarily what it's not the common usage. And that happened in my debate last Wednesday. Dr. Cardinal was showing 3 examples of beneficial mutations. At least 2, maybe all 3 of them were function loss. One is an elephant losing its tusk. Another was sickle cell anemia. I don't remember what the third one was, but the point is these great, quote unquote, great examples of beneficial mutation are really in the medical sense, either a loss of an organ or, almost like a limb or medically deficient. So I'm just pointing that out. So granted, in John Sanford's 2005 book, he uses the word beneficial, neutral, and deleterious. That's because he was working from the population genetics literature at the time. And, that was about 15 years ago. And a lot can happen in that time, and we could see clarity. So I'm hoping that in the future publications that he and I do, we'll be we'll point out to be careful to use certain words, because it means one thing in the literature that's very different than what the ordinary person or even ordinary scientist outside of evolutionary biology might think. So just some quotes. I'll read this, and there's some quotes. In order to understand the meaning of Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection, it is helpful to understand the definition of fitness which Fisher was using. This is not so trivial a problem, because in a 2009 paper on fitness, Alan Orr, who's an evolutionary biologist, he quipped, biologists have offered a staggering number of definitions of fitness. There's not even one definition, there are multiple, staggering number. And worse, another great evolutionary biologist, Richard Lewontin, he lamented, it's not entirely clear what fitness is. That's actually a really bad situation. If you are going to argue a theory that evolutionary biology does this or that, and you can't even define what fitness is, that's not really a great situation. That's not a great situation. And Andreas Wagner said this. He also said, however, fitness is hard to define rigorously and even more difficult to measure. An examination of fitness and its robustness alone would thus not yield much insight into the opening questions. Instead, it is necessary to analyze on all levels of organization the systems that constitute an organism and that sustain its life. I define such systems loosely as assemblies of parts that carry out well-defined functions. I'd like to focus on that last sentence. This is an evolutionary biologist speaking. He says, I define such systems loosely as assemblies of parts that carry out well-defined biological functions. Now, ironically, those words by an evolutionary biologist, it sounds very familiar to what Michael Behe said about irreducible complexity. Behe said in his book, Darwin's Black Box, a single system composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function of the system. A single system composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function of the system. So even evolutionary biologists are realizing they can't really build their own theory very well on a kind of an ambiguous definition of fitness, and they're sort of forced to be able to describe systems in terms that sound a lot like the way ID proponents would describe irreducible complexity. And I got to say, that has to hurt. That has to hurt. So sorry, I'm gloating, but that's me. And I'll give a few more quotes. Now, these problems are not in the headlines. You won't see these problems in the headlines. So most of the headlines is they'll find some fossil that's totally irrelevant, but they'll claim they've solved some evolutionary problem, and they never do. But the real headlines, the things that should be headlines, are not. Things like what I just read should be headlines because it's showing that the industry, the practice, the discipline of evolutionary biology on the whole is collapsing. It's built on shaky, very shaky foundations. No other discipline in the sciences would be able to tolerate such incoherent and very ill thought out non sequiturs and circular reasoning. But because it's evolutionary biology and it gives a certain narrative that satisfies certain people's worldviews, sadly, even some people claiming to be Christians, because it satisfied the way they think things ought to work, they get a free pass. And it's really sad. And I can give some examples of that. Anyway, Fisher's theorem is one example. And so maybe I'm going to close and open up for brief questions because we're going to wrap up in maybe 15 minutes. And I need to save my energy, my fighting energy for tomorrow. So in terms of engineering or the medical intuitions of fitness, the population genetic evolutionary biology definition of fitness seems disconnected, if not offensive to a common sense notion of fitness. For example, in the medical sense, sickle cell anemia is a heritable trait that can lead to sickness, but it is viewed as a beneficial adaptation in the population genetic sense. Natural selection could selectively favor loss of optical structure in Gammarus minus. That's an aquatic creature that dwells in caves. It's a crustacean. It's not a fish. It's kind of like a crab, I guess, since it's a crustacean. Or tusks in elephants. Alan Orr used the example of Gammarus minus to chide Daniel Dennett's naive views of natural selection when Orr pointed out, in reality, selection sees only brute birth, death, and reproduction, and knows nothing of design. Selection, sheer cold demographics, is just as happy to lay waste to the kind of design we associate with engineering as to build it. Consider the eyes of cave organisms who live in total darkness. If eyes are expensive to make, selection can wreck their exquisite engineering just as surely as it built it. An optic nerve with little or no eye is most assuredly not the sort of design one expects of an engineer's blueprint. But we find it in Gammarus minus. Whether or not this kind of evolution is common, it betrays the fundamental error in thinking of selection as trading in the currency of design. And this is an evolutionary biologist talking about the problem of design. It's just beautiful. A design proponent might not have articulated it any better. In fact, when I read this, I was like, oh my goodness, this is great stuff. I've hardly heard any ID proponent at the time, this is about maybe 15 years ago, say it so well. I'm just like, guys, don't you get it? Natural selection selects for bad stuff. And I was just like, am I the only one that's seeing this? Why doesn't someone publish a book? So, well, 15 years later, Michael Behe comes out and says, Darwin devolves. And I was really pleased, like in 2010, about 5 years later, Behe was seeing the same thing, that most things called beneficial by evolutionary biologists is damage. So what does that mean for evolution? So the next time someone says to you, oh, look, I have this genetic algorithm just shows how, if we just select for the best, it gets, the complexity keeps increasing. But a genetic algorithm is man-made and it's purposeful in trying to build up certain things. You can get it to design something that is more complex. But in the real world of biology, what happens, the way natural selection really works, and I'll say this, I believe God made natural selection, but it doesn't work in the way that evolutionary biologists claim it does. The way natural selection works in the wild is it prevents the evolution of complexity. We have experimental evidence, we have theoretical considerations that show natural selection should not increase complexity. That's why a bacteria should not evolve into a human being. Natural selection would prevent it. So I'm encouraging ID proponents, creationists, say natural selection doesn't work that way. Natural selection prevents evolution. It does not facilitate it. We have proof. The evidence is on our side. And by the way, Darwin plagiarized the idea of natural selection from a creationist, Edward Blythe. That was not a creationist who came up with that historical idea. That was the provost, Lauren Isley of the University of Pennsylvania. So there's just a lot of stuff on our side, and the evolutionary community has done a lot that is just really sketchy. It would not pass muster in any other scientific discipline. And I'm going to say something really offensive. I would say that evolutionary biology is not even a science. It doesn't deserve to be called that. It's just a pretend science. It's not real science. Real science are things like in chemistry and physics. So let me close with this thought. This new word is reductive evolution. Reductive evolution. There's actually a paper by Eugene Koonin, who's one of the top evolutionary biologists on the planet. He uses the term reductive evolution. That means evolution that kind of deletes things. That's why it's called reductive. He wrote a paper. He co-authored it with someone whose name I can't pronounce. He co-authored a paper that said reductive evolution is the dominant mode of evolution throughout geological time. So that we would have all these, if we accept the geological time scales in the fossil record according to paleontologists, which I reject, but let's accept it for the sake of argument. He said, we'll see all these episodes where punctuated by complexification that has, and he doesn't give a reason. He said it just kind of pops up where you have all this complexity. I presume he's talking about things like the Cambrian explosion where it just sort of pops out of nowhere. And then it's followed by reductive evolution. So most of the time, even in the fossil record, if we accept the evolutionary view, most evolution is reductive. Most evolution is reductive in lab and field experiments. It's reductive rather than constructive. And so I close with that, and that's mostly what I had to say. So I'm going to unshare my screen, and I know this was short, but I had a lot of fun. I hope the audience had some, if they had some questions, and we have about 8 minutes.
Or anybody else from the audience comes in, just so you know, if you head over to, until Sal gets it up on his website, if you head over to my channel, Logical, Plausible, Probable, you can watch a live stream that he and I did the other day where he really dives into the math. So this conversation has been much more about the top level theory and the significance and the ramifications and the significant critical blows, if you will, to the entire premise of neo-Darwinism. And if you, like I said, if you want to really listen to much more of the mathematical component of this that backs up what Sal's been talking about tonight, I strongly recommend you go over and checking out that live stream. I appreciate your conversation there, or your lecture here, Sal. It was very interesting, and I one of the things for me, you and I talked for almost 2 hours the other day, and I gleaned a lot from our one-on-one conversation, and I've gleaned more tonight, listening to you repeat some of these things again from slightly different angles, and it's definitely a very the term reductive evolution that you'd used. I remember you mentioning that, but it hadn't really. I didn't realize that was actually being perpetuated by traditional evolutionists, like you were doing in Koonin.
Yep, and the reason they have to, they're seeing it in the lab. When we study parasites, we see the parasites reduce their genomes. We're seeing the E. coli dump genes. It's just incredible. It's one of these words that sounds kind of dirty to an evolutionary biologist because it doesn't agree with their narrative. But in lab and field observations and people that are involved in conservation biology, where they're trying to preserve species and manage the, God bless them, they're trying to keep the environment going and keeping species at risk alive. They're seeing it. One can't run away from it. And interestingly, the people that actually deal with things like preserving genomes, such as conservation biologists, what did they do? Who was their keynote speaker in 2018? It was Bill Basner, because he was telling it like it is. And scientists that are doing practical things need to be told what it really is. And this is why I think the evolutionary community is a little bit on its heels, because the medical community said, for example, with the whole ENCODE and then all the follow-ons after it, the genome, we think, is functional. That got the evolutionary community mad. And I was just like, this is incredible. Why do they have to be mad? To quote a hockey player, if you ever seen that video, that was cute. Why do the evolutionary biologists have to be mad that, maybe 97% of your genome isn't junk after all? It seems like they're lamenting that they're not as much junk as they thought they were, which is
and so I think another major point that has to be derived from this component, what you're talking about, of yes, natural selection exists, but it is not necessarily a positive, and actually is a negative in terms of the end outcome. It also leads you back to if it is, then we are talking about a deprecation of function. Then the unavoidable route is that there had to be an overwhelming surplus, if you will, of function to account for variability. Already had to exist. It can't you can't come after. It must come before by default. Is that right? Or is that a fair supposition?
Yeah. And I know that, just as a side note, John Sanford's theory of, and Rob Carter's theory of created diversity, that's a slightly different topic. And I just wanted to say it's just a slightly different topic. When on October 17th, 2018, just before he spoke at the NIH, he spoke at my church, McLean Bible. And he said, his hypothesis is an answer. He said, it's not the answer necessarily, but it is a possible answer. So I think by and large, he probably is right. But, I'm just saying we don't even need to get there with diverse alleles, if that's what you're referring to. But I do believe we've lost a lot of function, both humans and all sorts of species. We see it in what we call the pangenomic, the pangenomes of bacteria. We see these bacteria have, like E. coli, for example, only 20% is conserved. That means a lot of E. coli has dumped their genes. Or at the very least, there's not a lot of selection pressure to keep acquiring new genes. So I just thought that was kind of interesting that we have so much experimental evidence like this of all creatures except maybe viruses. And Dr. Sanford said that in his even in his latest book of Genetic Entropy. So that's why I avoid the H1N1 issues. I'm sorry I'm talking. That was a whole basket full of ideas. Maybe not related to your question.
Well, for the audience, SFT and Sal were discussing the whole H1N1 thing before we went live. And just for everybody who is waiting in live chat, that's why we didn't start on time, is because the two of them were having to go into nerd mode and discussing the whole H1N1 thing and its ramifications. So and obviously I'm just messing with SFT and Sal over here, but no. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come over and share all this with us, because I agree with you. We don't have to say, hey, we have the answer to absolutely everything. However, we can make reasonable exclusions of what is the logical conclusion. And I think one of the things you've been really showcasing tonight is, while we might not know everything, we can come to a pretty reasonable conclusion that simplicity to complexity based on natural selection is not a rational conclusion based on the observable evidence.
That's correct. That's correct. And well, I think we're gonna. I thank everyone who's joined us, and I didn't see too many requests on the chat for questions. Unless there are others, we'll wrap it up. And since SFT has a debate coming up, and also I need to save my energy for tomorrow, the big match. I don't know that I've seen an professor of evolutionary biology debate a creationist anytime recently. So to me, at least personally, this is going to be a lot of fun. Let's see, Nicholas Whitmore. He asked about Edward Blythe. Edward Blythe, just Google him and then Google mysterious Mr. X. Mysterious Mr. X. If you Google mysterious Mr. X and Edward Blythe, you'll see the story and how one historian named Lauren Isley, let me type that in the chat also, Lauren Isley was the provost president of, I don't know which, they're both very senior positions, of University of Pennsylvania, which is an Ivy League school. And he wrote this because he felt Blythe has gotten kind of bad treatment by historians, because he really should have been credited with the idea of natural selection. And Blythe was a creationist, as far as we know. So Darwin plagiarized this stuff and then corrupted it. And so that's just an interesting thing. So that's all I have tonight. Maybe we'll join again. I'm hoping to be providing, I'm really not into debates. I'm more of I like to talk and lecture on science topics. So I have to debate maybe just to do a little bit of advertising for my lectures. But doing stuff like this is more fun. And I hope to have more like this on my channel and John's and SFT's. So thank you. And thanks for the plug, John, for debate tomorrow on Modern Day Debate, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. So that's all I have. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Ramat, for running the system. And thanks, SFT, for inviting me here. Thanks, John, for being a co-host.
No problem, man. Well,
so hey, everybody, before we wrap this up, make sure you jump over to the next live stream. It's about to go live here in a few minutes. SFT, he's backstage. He's watching his Rocky movies, getting ready to go after Snake was right. It's not actually a debate. They're going to have a discussion on, I believe, Adam and Eve, and should be an interesting one. So make sure you go check out that live stream here. That's going to be kicking off in just a few minutes. And Matt, I'll kick it over to you to wrap up, man.
All right. See you guys soon. Thanks again, Sal.
Thank you.